Hello. We're going to go live in a minute. Yeah. 21st century technology. Live stream. So it's fine to see. My name's Nanette Beckley, and I'm president of the Yale Alumni Association of the Northwest. Woo! I want to welcome the Blake Northrop class of 74, the Yale Alumni Association of the Northwest, and lastly, the Harvard Club, for being here today to hear from our friend and colleague, James Stock. His official bio reads, James H. Stock, we know that's for Harold, is Vice Provost of Climate and Sustainability, Harvard University, Director of the Salata Institute for Climate and Sustainability, Harvard University, the Harold Hitchings Burbank Professor of Political Economy, Faculty of Arts and Science, and a member of the faculty of the Harvard Kennedy School. He co-authored, I brought props, Introduction to Econometrics. It's kind of the Samuelson of today's economics. Dave knows what I'm talking about, okay? In 2013 to 14, he served as member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors, and he officed at the White House. He holds an MS in statistics and a PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. And Janet Yellen was his advisor. That's pretty cool. Yeah. Wow. I have known Jim most of my life, as many of you in the audience. Jim is in town for his 50th Blake High School reunion. I see Peter Alls, somewhere, Peter. Kathy Anson, me, Jim. We all were in 3rd grade at Kenwood School together. In 7th, 8th grade, while we were both at Northrop or Blake, Jim and I, and I think, let's see, Peter Halls? No, not Peter, Rich Walsh. We were in dancing school carpool together. It gets worse. Jim, Charlie Cronick, and I talked about how when we grew up, we would solve all the problems of the world. Now, Charlie is a lobbyist for Greenpeace in London, and we just heard about Jim. And Jim wanted to be a senator, and I wanted to be president. Well, it sort of happened. And then Jim's mother, Mrs. Stock, was the Northrop women in the rooms, in the audience's 9th grade English teacher. Remember, we read Tale of Two Cities. And then Barbara Stock was our head of school for the last graduating class of Northrop Collegiate School. And Mrs. Stock wrote my recommendation letter for Yale. I gave her attribution for me getting into Yale. I really needed the help. So at Yale, Jim and I lived across the street from each other for all 4 years. He was in Silliman and I was in TD. I rarely saw him as he was busy studying and I was doing other activities. He did form the Yale Ski Club and did the ski jumping cross country and downhill. And then there was a road trip for Aspen Spring Break. Remember when Steve Scheer is in the room? All right. So we're covering the room here. Last week, I spoke with a member of Blake's class of 74. And to paraphrase what he said, I am looking forward to the Jim Stock event. I really admire him for having the fortitude to give government service at the highest level in the Obama White House. And I said back to him, and he's also a really nice guy. Jim?
That's such a nice introduction, except for the dancing school part. I have many fond memories of growing up here. That is not one of them. First of all, it's great to be back. I think I might be the only person in the room who manages all three hats, the Blake, Harvard, and Yale hat, and it's nice to have those connections. And I'm really happy to see some people from Harvard here who braved the rest of the crowd to come and see this. Economists tend to be fairly serious people, and I'm an economist, so this is going to be a moderately serious talk, and so I hope that that's okay. But what I'd like to talk about is a topic that is on many people's minds, which is climate change, and more particularly U.S. energy policy associated with climate change. So let me just tell you just a little bit about how I got interested in it, and it relates to Nanette's final comments. Most of my life I had spent doing econometrics, which is fine. I find it's really an important way to look at the world, using data to understand the world better and to be able to make good policy. When I went down to the White House, they wanted me to go down there and work on macroeconomics and monetary policy and macro forecasting. And it turned out that, well, first of all, there's no monetary policy done in the White House. Second of all, there was not very interesting macroeconomics going on at the time. We were recovering from the financial crisis and just kind of tooling along. And the forecasting part was pretty easy because that's what I did for a living. So after about 3 months, I had, what am I going to do for the rest of my 2-year stint here? And climate policy was on the table. Nobody was taking that up. I was super interested. I'd been working in that area for many years and had the ability, had the honor, the opportunity to be asked to take the climate energy portfolio, and I've been all in on that ever since. So it transformed from a hobby to really what I do full-time now. I have the opportunity now to be the Vice Provost for Climate Sustainability, which is all on the academic side. It's on the research and education side. It is not on making sure we have LED light bulbs. We have a professional office that deals with the LED light bulbs, and they're very good. I work on the academic side, teaching, research, faculty hiring, that sort of thing. Trying to make a difference using the opportunity that I've been provided, essentially I've been given the name Harvard and given the word climate, and I kind of own those two words at Harvard, and how can I use those to really make progress advancing durable solutions in the world using the assets of the university. So including the, faculty, student interest, alumni interest, and so forth. So it's very exciting. I'm going to talk right now in a much more narrow vein on U.S. climate policy. So we've had some really interesting stuff going on recently. So I know there's some people in this room who actually have deep professional involvement in different aspects of energy technology and the energy transition, and hopefully you'll learn something. And there's other people probably who have sort of a less deep knowledge, and we'll go through some basics, but then I want to get into things in detail. Looking just a little bit ahead to the second half of the talk, next year is going to be a really interesting year. Well, it's going to be a really interesting year politically in any event. But it's going to be a really interesting year legislatively because many of the tax provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the Trump tax cuts of 2017, are set to expire at the end of calendar year 2025. So that means Congress everyone in Congress is committed to having a discussion around which of these should be extended, which should be modified. The numbers are huge. So these are tax cuts that were several, I don't know if you sort of go back and you remember when you started doing your taxes in 2018, you say, holy cow, this is really different than the year before. And all of those, many of those changes are going to be undone, whether that's the state and local tax deduction, whether that's some of the individual tax rates. There's a number of different corporate provisions. There's this thing that the qualified business income deduction and the change for pass-through corporations. So some of you might be affected by this. All of you are affected in one way or another. The numbers are really large. That will be on the table. I'll provide some more details on the numbers, but what that means is that there's an opening for lots of possible climate policy legislation that could happen through that process. And I'll talk about some of the legislation and a little bit about some of the politics of that. Okay, stepping back, so that's just to highlight where we're headed. Stepping back, setting the stage, we have in the United, and I'm going to be really focused on the United States here. We have in the United States seen CO2 emissions, total CO2 emissions peaked in about 2007, and then they've been declining since then. They've declined by a little less than, by about 20% to date relative to that peak. So that's great. That's one of the larger emissions reductions globally. And then the challenge that we have going forward is how to continue or maybe actually arguably accelerate that decarbonization of the economy so that we can achieve a transition to net zero and thereby reduce our climate damages. I should say, and I'm sort of hesitating here, I should say there's one prefatory remark I made. I'm taking it as a premise that we have a substantial climate challenge. That much of the climate challenge is because of man-made anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases. CO2 from energy is the major one of those. One can have different views about how quickly one needs to get to net zero, what the damages might be, and so forth. But the premise is that we do need to decarbonize our economy. The question is how we are going to decarbonize, what's the time frame in which we're going to do it, and how are we going to do it in a cost-effective, durable manner. So when I think about climate policy, I like to think about the ABCDs, or what I call the ABCDs of climate policy. It should be ambitious, broad-based, cost-effective, and durable. And each one of those is important. Ambitious is important because it's a huge problem. It's a global problem, and we have to be leading the way. Broad-based because it goes across the entire economy. So doing it by little dribs and drabs here is important, but that's not going to be a solution. Cost-effective because we're talking about big sums of money, and unless we have it cost-effective, we're not going to get the job done. And durable for the same reasons. It's got to be something that we can plan on, that businesses can invest in, that we can make investment decisions and research decisions and build on. So that's the premise. If somebody wants to take issue with those, I am all open to that conversation. I'm open to that conversation. Hit me later. The main reason that we've been decarbonizing is because we've been switching from coal for power for generating electricity to gas. And that really had to do with the advent of fracking and inexpensive natural gas. This chart, if you can see it, and it's probably hard to see from a distance, that big blue line that goes way up, that's power generated by coal, electricity, and you can see how that's just completely started to go downhill around 2010. But 2008, 2010 is right when the fracking revolution started, and that's when natural gas prices started to really crater. And 2014 is when they really cratered down to $2 or $3 per MMBTU. You saw a lot more generation with gas. Very recently, if you kind of peek down in the lower corner, that black line is wind, and so wind has been kind of going up steadily. And very, very recently, way down in that corner over there, I don't know if I can highlight that, but there's a little teal line, green or teal or something like that, which is solar. So solar is a huge deal. That's what people are investing in now. But actually, in terms of so far, the decarbonization, it hasn't played a big role. It will play a huge role going forward, but most of our decarbonization has simply been from gas driving out coal. Okay, another sort of stage setting thing. There are three. It's an easy way to remember where we get our emissions from today. About a quarter is from the electric power sector. About a quarter is from industry, and about a quarter is from transportation. Transportation actually is in the lead, but just by a little bit. So those are all roughly equal. It used to be much more from the power sector, but with all that coal being driven out by natural gas, now it's Now it's actually about a quarter of emissions. And then there's other stuff, agriculture and residential and commercial and so forth. And most in the transportation sector, most of that's from the cars that you and I drive around. So the heavy duty vehicles is an important part, but most of it's just plain old cars. So decarbonizing the economy in the first instance is about decarbonizing the power sector and decarbonizing all those cars. Okay. What are the tools? I hate to be pedantic here, but it's kind of useful. The tools, what are the tools of, and I'm going to focus on federal. There's a lot of interesting stuff in states. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the financial industry. There's a lot of other areas in which we see personal action is very important. My area is federal policy, so I'm just going to talk to you about the part that I know about the best. So what are the areas? You probably can't even read that on this small screen, so it's sort of more like a prompt for me than anything else. It's useful to think of there being 4 big buckets that federal policy can operate through. One of them is in regulation. And so some of you might be familiar with something called the Clean Power Plan, which is an Obama attempt to regulate the power industry. I was actually quite involved with that. I was the lead economist in the Clean Power Plan. My thinking has evolved a lot since. I think I was, in some ways, naive when we were involved with that. My thinking has evolved a lot. The Clean Power Plan was withdrawn, withdrawn by the Trump administration, replaced by a much, much less stringent policy called the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. That was withdrawn by the Biden administration and replaced by a much, much more stringent policy, which is what people refer to as the power plant rule. That saga started in about 2012. I was in the White House, and it hasn't finished. So if we want to think about so that's point one. Point two is that the Supreme Court has changed a lot during that period, and they actually, in a really important ruling, struck down the Clean Power Plan, even though it wasn't in effect. It was a very weird ruling from a legal perspective because it was on a regulation that was not even being proposed. It was just kind of there in the legal, whatever, the legal queue. They stayed it, and then they issued a decision that essentially really set up huge warning flags in the regulatory industry, in the regulatory area, saying that that the Clean Power Plan, because it was reducing coal so much, raised a major question that the legislation had not addressed. So Congress had not actually given the regulators the authority to eliminate coal-fired generation. So coal-fired generation is a major part of the economy, goes the reasoning. Congress had not given the regulators the authority to change major things in the economy when they had not spoken to that directly, and that is that essentially says this was a major question, and the major questions doctrine says Congress has to speak clearly if there's going to be a major action that's going to have large scale effects on the economy. So that was struck down. That makes me, and I'm not an attorney, but it makes me very skeptical that the new power plant rule is actually going to survive the Supreme Court. There's a very ambitious rule for a fuel economy that's going to be driving electric vehicles, electric vehicle penetration that the Biden administration has promulgated. It could be withdrawn. Well, actually, it's been finalized, so it can't be withdrawn, but a new Trump administration could replace it, but I think it's going to be struck down by the Supreme Court anyway, because if driving out coal from the power sector is a major economic question, surely eliminating internal combustion engines is a major economic question. What could be more American than the internal combustion engine? So I'm not very sanguine on there being much of a future for the regulatory approach. Okay, second approach is administrative reforms. This gets super weedy, so if you love federal administrative law, then this is your thing. It's incredibly important. So one of the things that I've become much more appreciative of is how important many of our institutional restrictions are for impeding the energy transition. So I'm just going to give you one example. There's a large number of solar plants that are in process. Solar is super cheap now. It is the thing that is where almost all of the investment in new power plants are going to solar plants, sometimes with batteries. To get them connected to the grid, there's this thing called the interconnection process, interconnection queue. The interconnection queue nationally, it varies from region to region. The interconnection queue is about 5 years long. So if you propose a solar power plant now and you put it in the interconnection queue, if you get through, it's probably going to come into production in 2029 or 2030 or something along those lines. So it's crazy long. It's a broken process, and going in and fixing these that's one of many, many broken processes we have that are impeding the energy transition. Going in and fixing these broken processes, it's extremely unsexy. It's extremely important. So that's something where you would see, thinking about administrations, very potentially large differences between a Trump and a Harris administration. But a lot of these things are such a mess because they don't have clear legal authority. So actually to make major changes, like major changes in terms of Federal Energy Regulatory Commission jurisdictional capacity or the ability to cite interstate transmission, that would require a change in legal authority. So just to give you an example, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission essentially has eminent domain powers, loosely speaking, for natural gas. So we can cite natural gas going across state boundaries, and it can sort of say we need to have this natural gas pipeline, and that's because it was in the Natural Gas Act of 1920. It does not have that authority for interstate transmission. Well, in the energy transition, we don't need a lot more natural gas pipelines. What we need a lot more of is transmission capacity for power, but we don't have the legal authority, the legal authority sitting in our agencies to be able to make that happen. And instead, if I want to run a transmission line from Quebec to Massachusetts, which is what we try to do, then I've got to get permission from Maine to do it. And there's absolutely no reason that Maine should say yes. Why do you want to have this giant transmission line cutting down trees in the middle of Maine? You know, what's in it for them? And so we haven't built any major transmission lines in like 20 years because we have a process that doesn't get it done. Okay, administrative reform. Third is in grants and loans. This is important, but I'm not going to really dwell on that because the numbers are really not that big. It's important, but it's important, but it's not big numbers. The final one is in the tax code. We've had for many years, we've had tax incentives in the tax code for different types of green energy transition. So I'm putting this down just because some of you might think, you know, wind and solar tax credits or EV tax credits are in the news right now because they're in the Inflation Reduction Act, and you might be thinking about it. And yes, they are salient and in the news, but they've been around for decades. So in fact, the first wind and solar tax credits were in the Energy Policy Act of 1992, and they were continued on and off sporadically since then. There's this thing called the biodiesel blenders tax credit, which has been around since 2004. Carbon capture and storage. Okay, carbon capture and storage, I think it's there's getting to be more salience, especially here in the Midwest, about what carbon capture and storage is. But it's, if you have an effluent stream that has a bunch of carbon dioxide in it, you can run it through some chemistry, pull out the carbon dioxide, pump the carbon dioxide underground, and that's carbon capture and storage. And if you do that, then, you know, in principle, you can run your facility, pull out the carbon dioxide, you get the energy, and it's good to go. So that's actually a completely legit thing to do. The reason it's in the news around here is because there's been a lot of attempts to do that to ethanol plants. Ethanol plants, what's ethanol? Ethanol is in our gasoline. It's distilled from corn kernels. And it's like an old technology, so making alcohol out of corn is not so new. But, and you know, there's that bubbly stuff that comes off. That bubbly stuff that comes off when you ferment is CO2. So the effluent stream from the fermentation process is actually a very CO2 dense stream. Standard plants just vent it. If you capture it and put it underground, that really reduces the carbon content or the carbon emissions associated with making that particular biofuel of ethanol. The problem with that is that it's really not clear who has jurisdiction to use. So you put it in pipes. There's a plant in Illinois that's actually doing this because it's sitting on top of the right geological formation to pump it underground. But you can't just pump it under any geological formation. It's got to have the right rocks, you know, the geology for it. And so there's a series of plants. There's a series of proposals to do that in Iowa and pump it up to store it in South Dakota and North Dakota, but you've got to have jurisdiction over who actually has the right to decide on these carbon dioxide pipelines, and that's complicated. Yeah, there's a question. It's on. Yeah. Oil fields, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so there's two, you're right. So the one use and something that actually been done for a long time is extracting the carbon dioxide, which is pretty incompressible. And so then it's actually a good gas to pump underground if you want to use that in what's called enhanced oil recovery. So you then can get the oil out of the ground by pumping the carbon dioxide in. You know, from a carbon perspective, it's not totally clear that that's like helping you out in a big way. So when I say carbon capture and storage, I mean the storage. It's stuck down there, and we're not using it for enhanced oil recovery. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so anyway, we have other tax credits. EV tax credits date back to 2007. Some of you might remember that. You might say, wait a minute, I didn't even know that there were any EV tax credits available back in 2007. And of course you wouldn't, because there were no EVs. And you know, if you bought an EV and whatever, they were like kind of crummy and expensive and so forth. So there's actually very little uptake of most of these credits for much of this time. The only one that there was big uptake was the wind, and we saw how wind was increasing there over the last decade. For most of these, there's been very little uptake. The Inflation Reduction Act, what it did is it consolidated these, it improved them in many technical ways, and it said we're going to have these in place for 10 years. So the biggest thing that the Inflation Reduction Act, people talk about the Inflation Reduction Act as being this revolutionary, really important piece of legislation. It was really important. It's incredibly important. It wasn't at all revolutionary, really. It took existing stuff that we had, improved it. It improved the plumbing of it, for sure, and then it made it durable for 10 years. And that's been allowing people to really make substantial investments. All right, what I'm going to do, maybe I don't want to, I mentioned a few of these. I think I might just skip most of this slide. This slide just goes through some of the major tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, but they're along the lines of what we've talked about. So I'm actually not, I can come back to that. So a question, okay, now setting the stage for where we're going to be going in in 2025, there's been a fair amount of modeling about what are we getting from the Inflation Reduction Act? How much is the IRA really reducing emissions? And the answer used to be about 10 percentage points. So this plot, this plot, if you can see it, is actually one of the most important plots that I would want to present to you. So the gray line there that's coming down is I don't think I can get my cursor. Oh, I can get my cursor here, good. This gray line here, if you can see that, that's actual emissions. And remember, those peaked around 2005, 2007. They've been coming down because of fracking mainly. Okay, so then what's this? These are projections. These are projections from a bunch of different models, different energy system macro models, of what emissions would be if we didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act. And you'd say, well, why is it going down? Well, because wind and solar are getting a lot cheaper, especially solar is getting a lot cheaper. So it's just natural economic forces. EVs are going to be getting cheaper. EVs are getting cheaper. They're almost cost-effective, cost equivalent. Certainly cost equivalent on a life cycle basis with internal combustion engines. So we would naturally see a decline in emissions even without the Inflation Reduction Act. What the Inflation Reduction Act is, it took these things that are getting cheaper and it said, I'm going to give you even more money to go use it. All right, so it's sort of throwing more, by putting more money on these things that are already getting cheaper, there's much better uptake. It's reducing emissions in 2030 from about 25% reduction relative to 2005 to maybe a 35 or even possibly a 40% reduction in 2005. So by about 10 percentage points. That's pretty good, 10 percentage points. 10 percentage points off of a base of about 35 percentage points. So there's 65 percentage points to go. So that means we have 5 more IRAs worth of emissions reductions to go. Okay? It's now the case, so that's okay, that's point number 1. Point number 2 on this chart, if I can get my cursor back, and I seem not to be able to, here it is. This little gray line down here, back in the beginning of the Biden administration, the Paris Agreement says that all of the countries are supposed to make voluntary things called nationally determined contributions, voluntary statements about how much we're going to reduce our emissions by future dates. We said we're going to reduce our emissions by, the Biden administration said we're going to reduce our emissions by about 50 to 52% by 2030. That's that red star, okay? That red star, we ain't anywhere close to that red star. Ain't anywhere close to that red star. And that red star is supposed to be America getting on a path to about net zero by 2050. The rest of the world it's harder for the rest of the world because the rest of the world isn't as rich as we are. It doesn't have and we have tons of solar resources and tons of wind resources compared to many other countries too. So, we've got a lot of renewable resources. So we're not anywhere close to that path. So that's the second main takeaway. Takeaway number 1 is, yes, the Inflation Reduction Act is making a difference. Takeaway number 2 is we only have 5 more to go. And takeaway number 3 is we're nowhere close to that 50% reduction by 2030 target. Okay, and I guess the sad part is takeaway number 4 is that most of the modeling has actually retrenched a little bit so that the reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act are likely to be a little bit less likely. And that's mainly based on this sort of sclerotic process of getting things connected to the grid, being able to build out that transmission, problems that are happening with EV penetration, electric vehicle penetration because of charging and so forth. So a lot of the human institutional problems in our system are causing people to retrench a little bit on these projections, and also the higher interest rates. So a lot of these are capital intensive projects and interest rates are higher than some of these earlier projections. Okay, so what are the looking ahead to 2025, we've got some pressures, certainly from the climate perspective. People who care about those emissions reductions are saying, oh my gosh, what's the next one of our 5 IRA type level things? But some of you who care about your taxes, say, what is Congress going to do for me about those tax things that are expiring? Are we going to have to go through some other, how are we going to have taxes going up, or who knows? Okay, and then that's all the backdrop for this is our deficit is really high and it's been growing. So we don't have we don't have as much fiscal headroom as we did even 4 years ago, not to mention 10 or 12 years ago. So that final thing is leading to, like lots of articles like, have we got some fiscal problems that are going to be problematic down the road for the nation. Okay, here's a very nice, relaxing picture of the long-term fiscal outlook. So the thing that's really dramatic about this is, so the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, makes these projections on our fiscal outlook just under what our current legislation is. It's not even current policy. This is what's on the books. Okay, so they take on the books, what's on the books. And what's on the books is we are running a deficit of about 8% of GDP, and we're just going to keep running it and running it and running it because we don't have any tax changes in the wings that are going to make it up. There's two ways to, I mean, look, it's not rockets it's really complicated, but it's not complicated. Either you spend less or you bring in more. Like, those are the choices. And Congress isn't comfortable, making that decision, and then this is the consequence. So we don't know where that's going to lead. That could lead, there is no economist that I know that thinks that this is, has a happy ending. Okay, I'm going to skip this chart. And the IRA, how much did the IRA add to it? There's an interesting saga here I'm not going to tell, a fun inside the Beltway saga of the IRA. So you probably all heard that the energy and tax provisions of the IRA cost $372 million. So $372 billion over a 10-year window, and sometimes they use the press uses the term 392. So some people use 372, some people use $392 billion. It was widely understood at the time that the IRA was passed that number was probably closer to $1 trillion and possibly closer to $1.4 trillion. And it was because of a technical way that not the CBO, which is a wonderful organization, but the Joint Committee on Taxation does its calculations, and those calculations were just widely understood to be low by a factor of 3 or 4. We were some of the first people to call them out in print. But this is now, conventional wisdom. So the IRA itself is a 1.2. So these numbers are big numbers. $1.6 trillion or $1.4 trillion over a 10-year window. That's a substantial amount. The total federal debt right now is in the order of $20-something trillion. So $25 trillion. So this is adding a chunk. It's not that whole path, but it's adding a chunk to that path. I'm going to go through some options, and I don't want to take too much longer here, but I want to run through this chart. Are we okay with the options? Okay, I want to run through some calculations. So let's go back, and we're going to focus on tax, and we are going to have tax policy made next summer. Not quite sure what it is. It's going to depend on who wins the White House, the Senate, and the House. We can talk about lots of different possible configurations. There's one configuration that's moderately clear, which is that it's entirely a Republican sweep, and then you can make some predictions. There's one configuration that's moderately clear, which is entirely a Democratic sweep, and you can make some predictions. Even those are going to be tempered because anything that goes through is going to have to go through in this so-called reconciliation process. So if it's very, very close, that requires 50 votes and it requires a majority of the House. And if the House is only slightly one side or the other, and the Senate is 51 votes or something, that means that any reticent party can have really big influence on where the legislation actually goes. So will, I think, be a moderating force on any legislation that we actually see. What might happen? This is a baseline from some recent modeling that we did over the course of over the spring about emissions reduction paths under the IRA. It's maybe a little bit optimistic. It's maybe a little more optimistic than I am in my heart, but that's our path. Okay, so what could happen? So I think one of the reasons it's more optimistic than where I am in our heart is, as I mentioned, I think that we're going to see basically a lot of the regulatory initiatives either pulled back under Trump, or alternatively, just if it's a Harris administration, just squashed by the Supreme Court. So I think this is, if we take the power plant rule and that regulatory emissions reduction out of the mix, then we'll see a less sanguine path of emissions. If one possibility that's kicked around is actually repealing, so if we have the Republican trifecta then you can imagine, and as a very extreme case, repealing the entire IRA. There's a lot of reasons why I think that won't happen, but just as a case to put out there, as an extreme case, that's going back essentially to our business as usual scenario and really not making very much progress on climate. Okay. Another possibility that's kicked around in Democratic circles is if you suppose we have a Democratic trifecta. Another possibility that's kicked around is the IRA has been such a success. It's certainly, it's popular politically. We're given these subsidies. There's a political theory about how these subsidies people are going to really react favorably to that. We'll see whether that happens in the elections, whether that actually works. Why don't we just take the IRA and increase those tax credits by 50%? They actually wouldn't do a whole lot. And the reason is that fundamentally increasing the tax credits for solar, which is the main driver of this, solar is already really cheap. And it's already got a big tax credit, and increasing those tax credits even more, there's only so much that you can do. So you could even, in fact, this is sobering, you could double those tax credits, and it's just not going to produce that much more on the margin. And one of the reasons is that you can produce all the solar you want in Arizona, but if the power plants are burning coal in North Carolina and in South Carolina, how are you going to get that stuff from Arizona to North Carolina? There's lousy wind in North Carolina, and actually they don't have great solar either because of the cloud cover that they have. So you still have got a lot of coal in the system, and you've got a lot of natural gas in the system, and you got a lot of solar out west. So what if about a carbon tax? So a carbon tax has been considered for a long time. You guys all know what a carbon tax is. Suppose we were to implement a carbon tax. The carbon taxes we're looking at carve out gasoline. So we wouldn't be putting it on gasoline, but we'd be putting it in the power sector. We look at two carbon taxes, one that's really small, that blue line, which is way below any of the legislative proposals. The legislative proposals are all those gray lines. And then and that's starting at $15 a ton. To give you a sense of what $15 a ton is, that's about 14 cents a gallon. So this is really a small number. You'd barely notice it at the pump, and we're exempting gasoline anyway in this simulation. Another one starts at about $65 a ton, so that's 60 cents a gallon. So it's something, it's noticeable, but it's not a ton of money. Okay. That's the effect of the low carbon tax. That's the $15 a ton carbon tax, and it really makes a big difference. And the reason it makes such a big difference is that, remember that coal in the southeast. Now that coal is really expensive, and all of that coal basically stops being used. It's substituted by natural gas, so it accelerates the transition to natural gas, but then that natural gas is also expensive, and that accelerates the transition to renewables. That's a 15 cent per gallon carbon tax. Here's a 65 cent per gallon carbon tax, and that actually achieves the Paris target of a 50% reduction by 2030. Okay, so what else might there be? So the red line here is a compromise scenario that we think about. So so what if you are trying to raise money for tax cuts? What if a carbon tax raises money? Whatever else it does raises money. And if you want to have tax cuts, income tax cuts, you can raise money for the income tax cuts through a carbon tax. You can also raise money by repealing some of the IRA provisions. So a particularly controversial provision is the EV tax credit, the $7,500 tax credit. That by itself is about $400 billion. So the red line is this compromise where there's the small carbon tax, you repeal the EV tax credit, and that's the main thing. And you can see that it also is a pretty effective emissions reduction strategy. You probably can't see this, unfortunately. This chart is important. This is the fiscal impacts. So what are the fiscal impacts? So repealing the IRA, you save money, okay? Repealing the IRA, if you keep the IRA and you have a $15 carbon tax, you actually save money because the carbon tax raises revenues. If you have a big carbon tax, you raise more money. It turns out that if you repeal part of the IRA, like the EV tax credits and a carbon tax, you can raise $1.4 trillion over the 10-year budget horizon. So $1.4 trillion, these tax cuts that are under consideration, like extension of the TCJA tax cuts, numbers that people kick around are in the $3 trillion and $4 trillion range. So coming up with, say, $1.4 trillion is a major step towards towards paying for some of these tax cuts. So I think that there's a lot of interesting possibilities. None of these will ever become legislation. The purpose in our doing these calculations is actually to make sure that we get the universe of people who care about these things to start talking in real serious ways with real numbers that are credible and done in a nonpartisan, unbiased way, and done thoughtfully ahead of time. And that conversation is now beginning in Washington. I just came from New York Climate Week, and there's some really good events where there's some really fluffy events, and there are really some really annoying events, but there's some really good events where people are starting to really take seriously this question of what might be able to accomplish, and being really hard-headed about making sure that there's emissions reductions coming out of them. So that is what I wanted to talk about. I can talk about other things too. Don't get me started on charging. I love talking about EV charging. It's a favorite topic of mine. But there's a lot of other little weedier things that can happen that could happen in Congress over the next year or so. But those are the tax ones are the big ones. And I'm also really happy to talk about sustainable aviation fuels, especially here in Minnesota, where that's important. Minnesota, I don't know if you noticed, do you know about the $1.50 sustainable aviation fuel tax credit that you have in Minnesota? Oh, it is like the smartest. It is normally I would say that state level policies on tax credits are just raw subsidies that are not really useful. This is a really smart policy. I think it's really setting the stage for Minnesota being the leading place in what I think is an incredibly important nascent industry, and that only that little $1.50 a gallon is, I think, potentially very impactful. Anyway, that's a digression. I said I wasn't going to talk about state policy. So. All right, questions. People must. I hope I haven't bored you or annoyed you too much, Steve. Yeah. Equitable. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think that's an incredibly important comment. I actually think that equitable and durable go hand in hand, because if you don't have something that's equitable, it's just going to blow up in your face. I mean, the most, you know, instrumentalist approach here is that equity is not just the right thing to keep in mind, but it's a necessary thing of making sure that you actually have a durable solution. The last thing we want is, it's not, if a perfect example of equity is in solar panel siting, solar grid scale solar siting. That one of many examples. But you know, historically, we have just gone and sited energy facilities in low-income communities, and that's caused a whole ream of problems down the road, and we haven't done it with community engagement. Now, if we think about, well, we're going to have to site a ton of solar farms all across the nation. Those are going to be in rural communities because that's where the land is going to be affordable. That's going to have big impacts on those communities. Those communities, the right thing to do is to make sure that those communities win from that transaction. But it's actually the only thing to do, because if you don't ensure that they win, the way we have our institutional structure set up, they're going to just be able to veto it. So equity and durability and cost effectiveness go hand in hand. But thank you, I agree completely. Yeah.
Well, earlier you said you thought you were naive back in
those
days. So what changed? What did you think then, and what do you think now?
I had a very sort of ivory tower, I would say almost elitist So that's pretty easy, right? Here's this guy, this economist coming from Harvard, and then helping to write regulations. I mean, what could be more elitist than that? So we're sort of thinking, how can this be done as, economically efficiently as possible? How can we achieve our goals? So it's all super rational, and it just didn't take into account any of the real world realities. It didn't take into account how is this going to affect people's lives? How are people going to react to this top-down approach? I think one of the big problems that we had, in the Obama administration is that a lot of our stuff was very top-down. And that is not taken well by large swaths of our population. So I think that, the entire regulatory agenda is one that is essentially, I know better than you, and I might think that I do know better than you, but that doesn't mean that my ideas are really necessarily the most durable ones or effective ones and are the best way for us to achieve as a society the goals that we need to accomplish. So I've at least in my head, I've moved a lot from that experience. I mean, the way I'll tell you, it was a really beautiful plan. The economics are great. It was really, really elegant. Yeah, I actually think to me it just boils down to economics. I mean, it's really quite unfortunate that in my mind that Europe and especially Germany has been embarking on this project of closing perfectly functioning nuclear plants while they keep their coal plants operating. I mean, that is bonkers. I'm sorry, I should use a technical term that's less judgment, but I think here in the U.S., it's all about money, really. It's super expensive. It's super expensive, even if you sort of magically said, I'm going to replace the Sherburne coal plant with a nuclear power plant, and I got all the approvals, and I mentioned the Sherburne coal plant because it's got all the wires and the interconnections and everything set. So suppose you could do that. It still is really expensive. But in reality, you'd have to get a whole set of new permits, and you'd have to get, you'd have to go through additional regulatory gauntlets. So that drives up the price even further. And I think it just turns into a matter of dollars and cents. There's other things that I could easily guess might be more cost effective down the road. Like there's these really exciting advanced geothermal technologies that have a similar flavor, which is you put in a lot of capital up front and then it runs pretty efficiently and it doesn't have a big footprint and it can generate base load that's clean. But all of those are just like really expensive. We should continue to think about that and continue to support it and hope that some engineers, companies are able to make progress on that. Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't want to go here, state policy. I'm a cynic, so I have very little faith that at a federal level we'll get our stuff together.
Yeah.
In a way that is productive in the next 20 years that really can make a meaningful difference, especially how important politicized this system. So logically that points me that any change in the U.S. can come at the state level. So if you had a magic wand
Yeah.
and more outside influence on policy making in Minnesota, what other kind of policy innovation or corporate innovations do you think would be impactful?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the challenges in the power sector, one of the real challenges with any state operating on its own is that all the states operate in the context of the grid. So Minnesota operates in the context of the Midwest Independent System Operator, which is a regional transmission organization that manages interconnections that goes all the way through the Midwest, and now they even have a southern branch. I think it might even go all the way down to Oklahoma right now. So if what that means is that any work that you're doing here can just sort of spill over dirty stuff, if it's cost effective, spills over dirty stuff into other ones of those states. So unless you coordinate across state, you can have tons of ambition in your state, and it just means that it's making it easier for people or whatever. Yours might be more expensive, but then you're making your state's power more expensive, but that means it's not going to be used as much as some other state's power that's dirty. So this is what's in the word called leakage, is the jargon for that, and that's a really major issue in the power sector for a lot of these state standards. And that means that these state standards, there's been studies recently that they're very expensive in terms of tons of emission reduced, and that's simply because they've just got these leaky sieves all over the place. So I think that's really tough. I would say that there's two things to double down on, which are much more local and jurisdictional, and places that I think could make a big difference. SAFs, I just think the SAF policy here is, I don't know who thought of this. This is really great, because we have this entire subsidy stack for SAFs based on the low carbon fuel standard in California, which you can sell into and get credits for, the renewable fuel standard, something called the 40B tax credit, which is a SAF tax credit, which is transitioning to something called a 45Z tax credit, which is a low carbon fuel standard, low carbon fuel tax credit. Everyone in the nation gets all of those, can get all of those tax credits, and that's worth about $4.50 a gallon. The problem is SAF is a little bit more expensive, so those tax credits don't actually do the job of supporting SAF. They're going to support something called renewable diesel or other technologies that are going to supplant diesel. That's not the future. The future is sustainable aviation fuel. That's where we're going to have real needs, and that's an industry to be catalyzed. It's fundamentally a agricultural or big land use industry, however you produce those fuels. That's what the Midwest is good at, and to say we're going to make ourselves the hub of it, and to do it in a really smart way. So a way that some states will say, we're going to create a innovation hub, and then they try to give you some grants and then get the land, different universities and so forth. They're saying, no, we're not going to bother with that. We're just going to give you money. So go ahead and do it. But you're not going to get the money in any other state. You're only going to get it here. So that's why I think it's Pine, what's the name of the town? There's a town where there's an old refinery, Pine Bend. The Pine Bend refinery is being converted over to the first major SAF hub. Thank you. Anyway, and that's like, you think aviation fuel, corn, whatever, how can that be high tech? This is high tech, and I think is really exciting. So that's an example. That's one example, and Minnesota has unique advantages there. The other example is in charging stations. So that is something that can be solved locally to a very first approximation. So if we think about distance driving that people in Minnesota do, yeah, you do there is an issue that you probably want to drive out west, or maybe you want to drive to, I don't know why you'd want to drive to Chicago, but you might want to drive to Chicago. But mainly, like, what you want to do is you want to drive up north to go to the lakes or something like that, or go to Ely or something. And so we can solve that in Minnesota. So there's actually some very concrete things that states can do to solve this charging problem. And unlike the power sector, where there's these negative things that leak out, I think the good stuff of charging is what leaks out. So if Minnesota and a half dozen or a dozen other states adopted similar requirements, for example, the same legislation requiring real-time data availability for on-the-road level 3 DC fast charging, that would set a national standard. All of the companies like EVgo and ChargePoint and so forth would want to, if they're going to have to do it in 12 states, they're going to do it everywhere. It then becomes available on Google Maps, and all of a sudden that means that the non-Teslas have the same advantages of the Teslas, except we've expanded by a factor of 2 the number of chargers that you can access in real time. That means it's going to be easier to buy an EV. You're going to want to charge more, because at least you can find the chargers when you're driving up to Ely. And it means that then, as the EVs become more prominent, then there'll be more chargers and more charge points will come in. So it's a virtuous cycle, and that can be done at the state level. And it can be done by adopting the appropriate model legislation among a dozen states. So I think you have to be smart about how you do it, because you can just waste money, but in other places there's really opportunities to be leaders. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so coal is currently expensive. If we had the most modest carbon price, like a 15-cent per gallon equivalent tax, coal would be just out of the mix in a matter of years. It's just not cost effective. Gas is interesting. The price of gas happens to be super low right now. I think in the long run, because of our exports of natural gas, we've connected our natural gas prices to the international markets. So our natural gas prices are going to be systematically $1.50, maybe more than they've been historically. That's going to be putting pressure on gas prices too, and gas usage. So it's and with the tax credits, this is a very good environment for the wind and solar penetration. So I'm very sanguine on the underlying economics of that. The problem is this institutional interconnection transmission set of issues. So that's really the whole thing. So the answer to your question is it depends entirely on how well we do on these institutional issues. And it's far from clear that we're going to be successful in that. Yeah. Yeah, well, we're undoubtedly going to be seeing lots of changes, right? We've already seen lots of changes. Personally, so this is like a really complicated question. So the climate scientists say lots of different things. They do not speak with one voice. I think I'm going to just say that I think that a number of climate scientists have been far too alarmist, and like there's a big thing around in the UN, the mantra is keep 1.5 alive. So let's do what we can to get below 1.5. I'm going to show you the 1.5 slide. Okay, so here's the 1.5 slide. Okay, here's the 1.5 slide. All right, so the black line is global emissions so far, and the blue line is sort of where we are likely to be in current policy. 1.5 is the green line. Like, what? Are you telling me, what? We're going to reduce, we can't even hit, the US can't even hit our Paris targets. We're not even close to hitting our Paris target of a 50% emission reduction by 2030. And now we're saying that the entire world should do that, like by 2030? It's just like, this is so totally unrealistic. There's no prayer of our hitting 1.5 degrees. Now, what does that mean? If you take the 1.5 alive mantra and the UN special report for 1.5, it makes you think that the world is going to fall apart. The world isn't going to fall apart. We had 1.5 degrees last year, 1.54 degrees last year, because it was this El Nino year, and it was a ridiculous, terrible year. Lots of deaths from heat. We had some, very unusual events. There was a lousy ski season here. But we're here, and biodiversity is okay. It's not the end of the world. So I think there's a problem of the overhyping of the near-term 1.5 and using that in a political way. That said, where we are right now, that has me super worried. That's a 2.5 or a 3 degree. Here's a plot of temperatures essentially since the beginning of human civilization. So temperatures since the beginning of human civilization have fluctuated in a very tight range of about plus or minus 0.5 degrees Celsius. And this is from ice core data. We're now way out of, at the very end, if you just squint, and you probably can't even see that, we're right now shooting way above that. We are, at this point, substantially above the range at which we've ever been as a species in our civilized history. We add another degree, or a degree and a half on top of that, we're going to be in uncharted territory. And it's not just uncharted territory for us, it's uncharted territory for lots of species. Yes, species adapt. They don't adapt in these time frames. It's uncharted territory for people who live in sub-Saharan Africa. It's uncharted territory for people who are going to be experiencing, you know, potentially lethal heat in India. So I think it brings us into a world where the uncertainties and the potential downsides are so large that we just have to be careful. So I view this as sort of a precautionary principle, not a precautionary principle about 1.5. We've blown through 1.5, but we just can't continue. We've got to do better than our current level. And I think I reflect a view of a large, but maybe not the most vocal part of the science community when I express this, but maybe the preponderance of the science community. Yeah. Thanks. It's great being with my three favorite educational institutions all at once.